Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining in from. I'm Neha Sami, the Associate Dean of the School of Environment and Sustainability at IIHS, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this conversation with Aromar Revi, the Director of IIHS, and also one of the co-investigators of the Peak Urban Project. I'd like to extend a special welcome to those of you who've been coming along on this journey on the Shaping Urban Futures MOOC, which is available both online on Coursera and on edX to the UN SDG Academy. For those of you interested, the links to the courses will be pasted in the chat. Before we get started on this, on our conversation, I'd just like to kind of walk you through a few basic, house rules. Please paste all questions that you want to ask us in the Q&A box. We'll pick them up towards the end of the conversation. And we might not be able to get to all of them, but we'll try our best and maybe try and address some of them at a later stage after the webinar. And we'll go for about an hour, including the Q&A. So without any further ado, welcome, Aro, and I just wondered if you wanted to kind of get us started by reflecting on sort of Peak Urban and the sort of the journey that we had both as colleagues and collaborators on the sort of shaping of that research and where it came from and the kind of interdisciplinarity questions that we tried to address through the work that we did.
Thanks, Neha. This is an interesting point. We're at sort of the midpoint between 2015 and 2030. And in some senses, there are many strands that led to Peak, but one of the strands that sort of kicked off the discussion was in 2014, after we had closed the presentation and the negotiations in to the open working group and the build up to the Sustainable Development Goals at UN headquarters. Some of us were chatting and we said, look, it would be fantastic to have a generation of younger scholars who can actually take this agenda forward across the world. Because it was a very tough job to try and convince the multilateral system that we really needed an agenda that brought together not only what we've been doing in the urban space for a long time. This was, about a year and a half before Habitat 3, which set up the new urban agenda. But this was more in sort of the mainstream development space where we were kind of battling to try and create a space for sustainable cities. And, IHS was quite important in that process, as were many other colleagues in the Peak Urban process in trying to kind of frame and help negotiate the SDG 11 agenda. In fact, we hosted the final meeting, which effectively defined the agenda as we went into 2015. So Peak came from the understanding that, we had institutions across the world that were working on parallel tracks, that we had scholars who were working using what we call now, I guess, new urban science. It's not that new; it's been around for a bit, but this brings together a whole range of new tools and processes, and that came together. I'm talking about things that happened in 2014, 15. About 3 or 4 years later, when a significant amount of resources was made available by the Global Challenges Research Fund to enable this to happen. And then we had colleagues. It was anchored, of course, by colleagues from Oxford. Michael Keith kind of ran the process there, but they were a phenomenal team from the University of Cape Town. Supanel was sort of deputy PI of this kind of process. She was partially based out of Cape Town and out of University of Bristol. We had remarkable colleagues from BEDA, from the Peking University, and from EFIT in Colombia, apart from IHS. And the interesting thing that emerged was really a dialogue not only between people working in context, which is in for, or effectively, if you take Oxford as another node, for major metropolitan centers from different parts of the world, but actually a conversation across culture, a conversation across method, which was really remarkable and interesting. We haven't seen this kind of work being done before at such a scale. Of course, it was kind of interrupted a little bit by COVID. Otherwise, we would have seen a lot more. But you can see from the prolific nature of the research, there are, I guess, 300-400 peer-reviewed publications that have come from this. But most interesting, was the ability to take a systemic view of the development of these large urban and complex urban centers. Beijing is, a great world city in some senses. Bangalore is sort of an emerging world city. It's a mega city in many ways. Cape Town is the center of a whole range of new experiments and challenges in African urbanism. And as we learned and spent time at EFIT in Medellin, Medellin actually has some of the most remarkable examples of going from a situation of deep conflict and then solving them in multiple ways. So this cross connection was really very, very useful. And I think we've been able to build a very successful partnership that will actually influence work in this space, I would say, possibly for the next decade, if not for an entire generation, because many of the younger scholars and many of us have actually not only formed fairly significant bonds, but are starting to write and theorize from practice together. And I think that too is the really important thing. It's not only a partnership very strongly across the global south, but an interrogation of processes in the north. And in some senses, when we were kind of trying to conceptualize this, sort of Oxford represents or represented or still represents an entire tradition of canonical knowledges. And in other parts of the world, you're finding not only practices that are cutting edge, that are responding to completely new challenges. For example, Chinese urbanization was not conceived of even in the 1990s in its transformative potential. It's not only transformed China, but in some senses, it's transformed the global economy, our views of what is possible and not possible on a whole range of things, from infrastructure to sustainability. And we had the ability in peak to interrogate that across these contexts. So for example, if you're working on transportation and looking at its connection, you can look at it in multiple contexts, and you could really try and understand how one could theorize and also do pragmatic work, in multiple locations. And I think for us at IIHS, it's given us a tremendous opportunity, not only to examine these questions, but to understand a rapidly growing metropolitan area like Bangalore quite dramatically. The population of the city has kind of almost doubled over 20 odd years, and its size has also expanded tremendously. It's a center of innovation. In fact, I would say it's one of the 4 or 5 mega clusters at the moment in the world, which concentrate not only innovation happening around AI and ML, but also dealing with kind of incubation of a whole range of new initiatives that are happening, not only in the IT space and the BT space, but also I would say in the social space. So in that sense, we had a tremendous opportunity to look at the metropolitan area systemically. I worked on the city for a long time, and the difference from when we were working on it, let's say in the late 1990s and now, is that we have a set of scholars who can really sort of integrate and engage stuff, and especially in IIHS's context, most of us are not only engaged in scholarship, but we're actually engaged in changing practices and also dramatically interrogating policy. So, all of this sort of came together, and it's, I would say, a very rare opportunity, but in some senses, peak gives us a sense of how collaboration partnerships would work as we look at the engagement across cities in different parts of the world, whether it's diplomacy at one end, or dealing with resilience, or dealing with the climate crisis, or dealing with questions of inequality, which have really emerged very strongly during COVID. This has given us the framework to try and build these new partnerships and new imaginations. So you've done a lot of this work yourself, so it might be interesting for you to reflect on the kind of things that we learned as you were managing peak, and give us some examples of how it was grounded in the Bangalore context.
Thanks, Ira. That was actually really kind of an interesting kind of reflection on that. For us, I think there were two, critical things that emerged. One was because we are rooted in Bangalore. I think it helped us tremendously kind of build out the Bangalore Urban Observatory that we're starting to put together to try and collect not only sort of novel data sets, quantitative and spatial data sets on the city, but also look more broadly at culture, at history. One of the key outputs that I just put out actually was an exhibition of kind of both historical, contemporary, and sort of future forward maps that kind of documented the history of the city, both the economic and spatial history, but also cultural and natural resource history as this and how that changed as the city evolved. And that exhibition, I think, is one of the most kind of wonderful sort of non-verbal, non-written kind of outputs of that work that we were able to put together. I think it was also kind of really, really critical in enabling us as sort of Southern partners to be able to build out a new generation of sort of younger practitioners, not only as researchers, but also, through our students and the learners who've been with us both through our Urban Fellows program as well as through the MOOC. And I wondered, Aro, if you would like to reflect on some of, the translation of our research, both into our teaching programs as well as beyond.
So I think, Peak has really given us a very interesting set of insights, and we've translated it concretely into, of course, the Urban Fellows program. There's a book that we produced earlier this year, which is kind of doing the rounds internationally and in India just now, of how you can basically build an interdisciplinary sort of urban educational program. And I think one of the core challenges in doing that is to not only, access knowledges, but access sites in which people can connect into actual practice and seeing what is happening. And the connection between theory and practice and research becomes, in a sense, somewhat blurred. And I think Peak gave us the ability to do this. So, for example, we did work within the Peak Urban program in Bangalore at a very fundamental scale, looking at the spatial structure of the city, entire new systems of trying to look at spatial organization, not only in 2 dimensions, but in 3 dimensions were actually structured. So there was a lot of very interesting, fairly high-end work in machine learning that was done to sort of develop the spatial structure of the city. In fact, we've used those methods to try and understand Mumbai, which is, again, a very unequal city, but also has this tremendous densities in some places. So looking at densities and organizing densities and relating that to, for example, how water is used. So traditionally, and India and many other parts of the world struggle in their planning processes because we're using planning tools from the 20th century, which are essentially land use planning tools, which then encounter new things like the car or new forms of technology, and that kind of defines how the urban landscape is organized. It's actually much more complex than that, as we could see in Peak, and we know otherwise. These are complex adaptive systems. And for example, if you have to integrate questions of water scarcity, and Bangalore is a city, it's one of the few mega cities in the world that sit on a plateau, shouldn't actually exist at this kind of size, like Mexico City or Addis or Quito for that matter. So it's seriously challenged in terms of access to water. So if you were to use water as an organizing principle for urban planning and building resilience, etc., you would actually come up with a very different urban form. And in some senses, one of the core things in Peak was it's important to look back. We can look back maybe 50 years, 100 years, or 200 years. But the future is not an extrapolation of the past or even the present, because the future is changing dramatically because of these exponential changes that are happening, plus because these are complex systems with a whole range of interconnections that are coming because of the internet, economic activity, a whole range of other processes. The emergence that you see is not easily, in fact, I would say it's almost impossible to explain them through linear extrapolations or even kind of, traditional models that we have, even in economics. So by looking at the spatial structure, by understanding how water is organized in the city, and we were separately doing work on climate change in Bangalore, and of course doing significant work on planning, you can then start to interrogate what sort of new landscapes and organizations would look like, what kind of new institutions would be required. And then, of course, critically, because in Bangalore's case, water effectively is energy. We pump water a kilometer up, we pump it 100 kilometers to get to the city and draw it from a river which is actually in deep conflict because of downstream and upstream demands that are there. So if you cannot look at water without looking at energy, right? So how does energy play itself out? What kind of energy landscape functions in the city? How does that play itself out in terms of access and inequality? And how does that relate to the energy transition that we know is absolutely critical to us, irrespective of what area, what region or what city you're in the world, because we wanting to try and keep the entire globe at below the 1.5 or at worst the 2 degrees threshold. So this ability to interrogate these kind of processes in space is not only good for research and policy, because that's exactly what we do in the city, but also it gives you a grounding as a student in the Urban Fellows program, or as somebody who participates in the massive open online course that we've helped create and anchor, to try and engage with these questions, because there are few places in the world today where you can address these these sort of systemic challenges and opportunities in space, because eventually you have to address them in a particular place, in relationship to a set of people who live there, institutions that exist within a social or political context, and of course the ecosystems in which they're embedded. So this has given us a very strong understanding of how that can happen. And in a sense, one of the most powerful things that emerged out of this was we were asked at very, very short notice. We had about in the middle of COVID, by one of India's most important constitutional commissions, to help them try and imagine how we could structure a post-COVID recovery program for the country. This was on the back of what was happening in Europe, in the Green New Deal, and of course what happened subsequently in the US around the administration's attempt to try and use infrastructure as a way of trying to sort of reinvigorate and recalibrate and accelerate economic recovery. And we used urbanization as a frame to do that. And where did we get let's say, the courage or the sense of how we could make that happen? It came from our experience, not only in other parts of the country, but our core experience in Bangalore, to say, look, if you take a metropolitan region or a set of urban systems, what kind of strategies would you adopt of densification, of connectedness, etc.? And then based on that, how would you address questions of equality? How would you questions of infrastructure, of housing, and of course, most critically, because that was what our job is, how would you structure an investment program which would add up to maybe 1.5% of India's GDP? And that's a lot of money. India's GDP is about 3 trillion, so 1% of that is a fairly large sort of annual investment that's there. And we were able to do that because as an institution and as a set of practitioners, scholars or scholar practitioners, we were able to ground this in context. And Speak gave us that confidence. It gave us the courage. It also gave us the analytical tools to try and bring into the planning and the regional development framework questions of resilience, questions of risk, and very critically questions of employment, which are often forgotten in this landscape. So I would say there's a very close connection between the policy and sort of outcomes that we see in our work and the underlying science and practice which is tested at regional and local scale. And there are many other examples. I mean, I'm sure you'd be happy to share other examples of how we've taken this work on, let's say, in Bangalore, and connected it to corridors and economic development, because that is a core question that we tried to address in the Finance Commission report.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think some of the critical work that we ended up doing was not only teaching, from this in our Urban Fellows program, but also quite critically, I mean, policy inputs that we gave to, again, the Niti Aayog, which is, one of the kind of planning bodies at the national level in India, as well as the Asian Development Bank on their investment portfolios, on connecting up economic development questions to infrastructure development. And for the first time, actually trying to use urbanization as the driver for some of those, for some of those investments. And that came directly out of the work that we've been doing through Peak Urban. And some of that actually is kind of synthesized in the Peak Urban India report, which is now available online on the Peak Urban website. And I think, Aro, just thinking more broadly from the report outward, to think a bit about how, as practitioners and policymakers, who many of whom are on the sort of SUF MOOC, how are ways that you will think about sort of this interface between science and policy, both, of course, the work that we've been doing through Peak Urban, but also the global policy engagement work that you've been doing across kind of the work on climate change with the IPCC, as well as the Global Commission on the Economics of Water and various other kind of engagements. What are the ways in which sort of policymakers can think of interacting between kind of research, science, and their work?
I think we've seen a significant shift in the discourse in this space. So, for example, with David Satterthwaite, I co-led the IPCC's key chapter in the last cycle, the AR5 cycle, which closed in 2014 on urban areas. And when we started this work in 2007 and 8, this is well before the SDGs or even the newer urban agenda was around, it was a big struggle to try and convince people, not only in the climate space, but also in the development space, that organizing processes or let's say interventions or programs around the process of urbanization. It's not only about metropolitan centers or big places, etc., which people often confuse. It's actually the entire settlement system that's there, which is in a sense the sort of anchor that we've used in the new urban agenda. We're looking at the entire settlement system. This, if you go back 50, actually not 60, 70 years, if you go back to the work of Doxiadis and Ekestics, is really the frame that we try and use. So that gave us the sort of the opportunity of trying to redefine the role of urban areas in, let's say, climate. And then subsequently in the new cycle that we've just closed, cities have emerged, or let's say the process of urbanization has emerged as a very important response to the challenges of climate and building resilience. So it's addressing not only questions of sustainable development, and there's a discussion, there's a question, of course, in the Q&A about that. It's not only about SDG 11 and sustainable cities and communities. That was a space or a marker that I think the urban communities across the world, cities and regions have to be able to land in that space. It's actually something that's right across the SDG system. So let me give you a kind of, a set of concrete examples that are there. So in the Bangalore case, and I'll bring it back into the climate space. In the Bangalore case, we are now working on a very interesting challenge. That is rapidly growing megacity, 10 to 12 million people that's there. You have to try and build, mass transit systems in the city. So what kind of options did you take? And one of them, of course, is a metro, but the metro itself doesn't exist without context. The context is of the urban fabric, the run markets and how they operate, where people work, and how labor markets are organized, especially in the city. And of course, in Bangalore's particular case, how the process of sort of post-industrial transformations are actually taking place. This is an interesting city. It's a green city. It's had a long history of industrial development, but clean industrial development, going back literally to the Second World War. So we are currently working with a whole range of agencies in the city, including the Metropolitan Development Agency and the Metro Development Agency, to help them build out 2 of the new metro lines. Right now, what has helped us sort of fast forward this process and understand it is the work we did in Peak to understand how real estate markets and land markets were functioning. And they're very complex in a city like this, which is rapidly growing, that has a odd kind of a structure. Bangalore is like a donut. The center is kind of a very low density of particular kind, and the peripheries are growing very dramatically because of the growth drivers in various cases. So understanding how the land market functions, both practically and sort of, in a much more abstract kind of way, enables us just now to interrogate how transit-oriented development across the city would play itself out, and how that relates to the spatial structure in a particular context, how wide the corridor should be, and how it connects to other forms of connection, how it connects with paratransit, how it connects with bus systems, how it connects to walkable neighborhoods in some senses, because that becomes, I think, for a city which has the kind of weather endowments of Bangalore. Bangalore is a wonderful city most of the year, but has lots of other challenges in terms of congestion. How do you bring this all together? So I think that's a classic example of how, if you're able to build this thing out, build out the process of building a sort of metropolitan system that allows rapid transit, which provides for not only all multiple forms of land uses, but also the fact that the city is very diverse in terms of its residents. You have people who are relatively new residents that don't have any resources at all, and maybe migrants who really suffered during COVID, to people who live in low-income neighborhoods. Bangalore, unlike other cities, doesn't have too much of slumification in some senses, all the way up to some of the richest people in this country. So how do you manage that diverse environment, enable all of these communities to be able to function and work together and transform themselves as the nature of work actually transforms itself in the city, is the kind of set of questions that we've been able to ask in Peak and translate into very concrete terms. I mean, the metro is actually being built. It'll be built between the airport and Silk Board in the next couple of years. And we're being able to use this understanding of the dynamics of the city, how predictions will actually work themselves out using much more sophisticated tools, and also sort of embedding it with questions of equity, justice, and I would say a much better and more sustainable life for everybody. So that's a concrete example. So if I bring that back into the climate space, one of the core things that we bring out in the current IPCC assessment is the fact that as far as mitigation is concerned, the demand side is really the cutting edge space. We can actually reduce maybe 30 to 50% of emissions by actually looking at the connection between planning, transportation systems, and more sophisticated and more challenging things like dealing with food and food systems, which again is something that IIHS works with very closely. So if you look at it in a systemic kind of frame, you're able to connect processes that are actually happening at the neighborhood level on the ground through what's happening at the city scale, at the regional scale, and of course, all the way up to global scale. Because the challenge we have in questions of building resilience or dealing with biodiversity is how do you build processes that aggregate innovation and struggles in some senses at the local level and delivers outcomes at the global scale. So I think Peak and other such processes have given us a much better handle on how to handle scale, to bring together multiple sectors of economic activity and governance and deal with complex institutions. I mean, in fact, much of your work, Neha, has been on how does one set up the governance of these kind of spaces and reimagine governance in the 21st century. We're clearly in the Anthropocene. So what does governance mean in this context, in a very contested and unequal environment? That may be something you might want to speak to.
Thanks, Aru. I think the challenge actually has been to not only reimagine governance in a sort of contested environment. I think some of it is also to think about, how do you plan for governance for emerging urban centers, places that are, in the process of sort of becoming urban. And I think that this is also something that we've been able to kind of pick up from the work that we've done for Peak and sort of work with state governments in India, most recently the government of Rajasthan, to help them think through, how they plan urban transitions. And I think that is something that I feel is sort of an emerging question in a context like India and many other southern countries where, particularly across Asia and Africa, where we're beginning to see a lot of, small towns and villages become centers of very rapid growth and urbanization, while at the same time, being unequipped institutionally in terms of capacity and in terms of governance mechanisms to actually deal with some of these challenges. And what we found is it's across sort of multiple layers or sectors. Some of it is a capacity question, some of it is a lack of data, some of it is, the lack of sort of institutional architecture. And I think that what we've been able to do is to think quite concretely about how can we anticipate some of these changes and therefore preempt governance challenges that are that a lot of these emerging settlements might face. Also translating out from places like Bangalore, given sort of fragmentation challenges, for example, given the kinds of challenges that that the city has faced as it has grown quite rapidly over the last decade or so. And just sort of building on that, I was thinking a little bit about the kinds of work that we've done through Peak, particularly about working in a data scarce environment like India. And you mentioned a little bit before about the kinds of novel data sets that we've created and the work that we're doing to put together the sort of Bangalore Metropolitan and Urban Observatory. And I wondered if you had some reflections on that.
No, I think this is something that sort of tied us together across all of these 4 geographies that are there. So, for example, I mean, if you looked at, it was a real important experience and a revelation for us to see, for example, how Medellin has managed its urban infrastructure. So, Medellin, in spite of being a very conflicted city where there was endemic and very, very serious violence for a long period of time, was able to build, a utility which that delivers water supply and, power services to pretty much, I mean, effectively across the city. So it's a universal coverage that's there. It doesn't matter whether you're in the favela or you're in an upmarket neighborhood. That's one thing that actually helps sort of integrate and deliver the services. And the most interesting thing for us was how do they manage those services in a data scarce environment, especially when there are a whole range of institutional disruptions happening. There are car bombs going off in different places. Metropolitan rail systems are challenged, and of course, economic life is very threatened. And in effect, that utility is so well run that the municipality depends critically on it for its surpluses in terms of revenue. So the question is, if you can run a utility like that in such a highly divided city, which a very complex terrain, then why should you not be able to do that in other places, right? And then the question then is, okay, what are the minimum sets of information, data, institutional structures, and processes you need to be able to translate those kind of experiences into other locations? Or similarly, if you look at Cape Town and you look at, Cape Town's own history of, because of apartheid planning, of its huge sort of inequality in how spaces are organized and serviced, and how the city then has developed. These become interesting questions for us in other contexts, and let's say in Bangalore's context, of how you deal with questions of spatial inequality. So, the question then is, okay, there may not be too much of data on spatial inequality. Would you go out and do, surveys of tens of thousands of people to understand that, or would you use a mixed methods approach, which would use satellite imagery at one end, use other data sets which are used for something else? For example, in India at the moment, one of the data sets that is used the most actually comes from the health sector. But we're using health sector information to actually try and understand socioeconomic processes. But for us, especially at IIHS, the question is, how do you bring that together in space? And I think one of the core things that really advanced work in computer science and statistics, in modeling, that has come to us from Peak and other places, because we have really highly skilled teams, some of the best in the world, working on geospatial data on large data sets in the UK, in China, in Colombia and India, is to develop new methods that try and interrogate these processes. Of course, this is before the sort of generative AI kind of wave has overtaken us. But the challenge, I think, with generative AI is that a lot of what happens sits in a black box, right? And we've actually developed fairly sophisticated systems that are applied to processes that actually have a piecewise continuity between, let's say, the limited data that you have, an understanding of what systems need to transform, and the policy and implementation processes that connect that into the daily lives of everybody. The challenge I think we're going to be facing, at least with generative AI for a while just now, is there's so much in that black box that it becomes almost impossible to try and relate it to a particular context. And we have to develop a whole range of new tools that sort of bring this together. So yes, of course, we did use machine learning significantly on the method side. There was some very sophisticated analysis that happened, even on the, I would say, on the borderline of applied mathematics in this space to understand these processes. But you have to be very creative. And there's this very deep dialogue between what's happening in the social sciences, in governance, in, of course, organized systems like, let's say an energy system, or I was talking about a water system or transport system, and how that sort of integrates itself with the urban context. Because, we are now trying to navigate ourselves through the space using a set of indicators, which, let's say, the SDGs give you, which are very aggregated and actually are very difficult to localize. I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time trying to think and work on how one would localize these processes, or on the other hand, how you take local processes and influence and transform national statistical systems to be much more sensitive to challenges and opportunities of spatial organization. And I think in Peak and the work that we've been doing at IIHS, we've really pushed the frontiers of this process, and the dialogue with colleagues in different parts of the world have really helped that. For example, Beijing, our colleagues in Beijing were working with such large data sets on movements of people that we couldn't imagine that in other places. And they were using that to actually do, I would say, almost predictive modeling of what would happen in terms of planning, in terms of transportation, in terms of congestion and inequality. And as other parts of the world start catching up, and we're able to try and bridge this sort of gap between crowdsourced data, what is currently available with the large, internet providers and stuff like that, and what national statistical systems or what city governments pull together. We have to be very creative in trying to, decisions have to be made. Investments are being made continuously in not only conditions of scarcity of data, but also deep uncertainty of a dynamic world in which nonlinearity is the most important, characteristic that you have to deal with. So how does one take decisions? How does one deal with these kind of questions is, I think, a very critical question. And I think we're trying to educate a new generation of urban practitioners and policymakers using these tools. And that, I think, is going to be very useful in the future. I'm not saying that we've got answers to, even half the questions that we have, but these tools are fundamentally different from what, we're traditionally taught within planning schools, and I would say in even the best universities in the world. This is a generation or maybe a generation and a half ahead of what's currently taught and practiced with.
So actually, that's a nice segue to one of the questions. I know you answered part of the question on sort of the new urban agenda and SDG 11, but I think they also wanted to hear more on how kind of the smart city strategy and thinking not only about smart cities, but how can kind of policy be replicated to other southern countries. And I think that's something we dealt with, in peak by trying to sort of work with other southern countries. And I don't know if you had reflections on that.
No, thanks. No, thanks for that question, Stevie. It's an important question, but I would caution first, policy replication is a recipe for number of challenges. The first challenge, of course, is that it doesn't work in many cases because, the context of, let's say, a Latin American city or a, South Asian or a Sub-Saharan African city is very, very different. So in some senses, we try and pick up policies and apply them in various places. And in some ways, some of our multilateral institutions are responsible for this. And it's very sad to see them fail because, resources in the sector we work in is quite limited. So one has to be very careful about policy replication or even borrowing in some senses. So I would say the value really is in having people and institutions that are able to take the theory and apply it in their context and, and build on from there. And I think that's where, in a sense, the epistemic or the ontological structure of the new urban sciences is fundamentally different from other things. It's not a body of knowledge that you apply unthinkingly and without context. So context is critical, and this context is also changing very dynamically. Fine. So the challenge for us is to be able to, without spending too many significant resources in some senses, be able to try and build this together. So the difficulty that we had was in the tension between 2015 and 16. Was the new urban agenda was, it embraced all elements of the urban space. In a sense, it was a very interesting and comprehensive process. I was involved with that, as with the negotiation on the SDGs. The challenge with that is because it was touching everything, it was very difficult for national governments to either accept and certainly city governments to try and implement. So the SDG 11 process or the SDG frame was a little bit easier, even though it was in some senses only picking up some of what we were really wanting to do. And it became something that was able to move into policy and implementation much more clearly. And the challenge with something like smart cities, and I know you touched on that, is if you look at it in the SDG agenda, fine, it's not so much the smartness, which may be something that particular firms or particular ways of sort of organizing things are organized. It is really about the connectedness we're talking about. So unfortunately, many of the smart cities that are being launched in many parts of the world forget that the real smartness is in the people and less in the infrastructure and the technology. Fine. The challenge is in the institutional frameworks. So if you focus on the technology side of it or the hardware side of it, and you forget the rest of it, then in a world that is driven by informality and you have climate change and all kinds of other things happening all at the same time, you'll be lost. And that's where I think we've really got lost. So you've lost the high level sort of connectedness. So the issue in that we were trying to touch with in SDG 11 was the idea of what happens in a much more deeply connected world. And we saw that happening during COVID, when the connections were disrupted because physical movement is difficult, or the internet became, a big bottleneck, like in India, where we had 250 million children who were out of school. So I think, we have to be careful about how policies are developed and organized. We obviously need to learn from each other, but there's some things that are universal, and there are not too many things that are universal in that sense. But there are lots of things that are particular, and our theory and our practice needs to be able to connect the two across scale, across institutional types, and across sort of economic and clustered areas as far as that's concerned.
Thanks, Aromar. I think the other sort of just broadening out from one of the other questions, and I think you touched upon that briefly earlier as well, is how do you sort of contextualize infrastructure to, I think the question is about unique geographical areas, but I think some of the work that we've done through Peak and also are continuing to do at IIHS is about reimagining gridded infrastructure systems and rethinking some of that. And so, in responding to this, I'm just thinking a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing about infrastructure, so let's say if I look at the energy infrastructure, so a lot of the urban structure that we see today whether it's in the north or the south, comes from the fact that we have fossil fuels that are, they're concentrated and allow tremendous amount of concentration. So if you look at the large metropolitan cities of Europe and North America, and to some extent Latin America, because they urbanized in the 20th century, the availability of coal-fired power plants and their ability, and oil in some cases, and their ability to bring it into the city, and then the form that developed on that from that because of transit, etc., is very clear. Now, the challenge that we, or let's say the opportunity that we have today, is that we are now working with a three-dimensional energy landscape. So whether it is photovoltaics or it is wind power, that's we're drawing energy from three dimensions, and it's not coming from 100 or 200 million years ago from the Cretaceous, where you can take it and you can burn it in a few years. That not only leads to a whole range of new opportunities for, let's say, rooftop solar, which has taken off and transformed the European landscape, and starting to do that in other parts of the world at the moment. But also how you configure and organize energy systems. So you do have to think of let's say climate justice or energy justice in the context of spatial justice, which is exactly what we were doing in Bangalore. And then it sort of kind of strikes you that the 20th century forms of the automobile and deep gridded infrastructure, which require tremendous investment, may not be valid for two reasons. One, of course, is in the cities of the south, informality dominates. Fine. So when informality dominates, in many cases, gridded infrastructure doesn't reach you. In Indian cities, people sort of occupy a piece of land or it's developed, and the infrastructure comes 10 or 15 or 20 years later, which is kind of unfortunate. So we have this very interesting debate between Chinese and Indian scholars on this, because China has taken, the infrastructure route first, and they've been able to execute that in many places. So in a situation where informality is kind of the organizing principle in many parts of Africa and some parts of Asia, how does one conceive of infrastructure? So non-gridded infrastructure, how they work, what's the dynamics of them, how do you govern them, how people access them, what's the economics of that process, of those processes, is important. And simultaneously, you have the fact that, let's say, like I said, in the energy systems case, you're using a much more distributed set of infrastructure. So how do you govern these processes? Will it be publicly maintained and managed because of the kind of lumpiness that we saw in investments in the 20th century, even down with coal-fired power or fossil fuel power? Or could it be public-private engagement? Who owns the wires? Who owns the generation capacity? How is the organization of production and consumption organized? Because now you have potential fleets of electric cars that can be used for storage. You have a completely new spatial and sort of, I would say, an economic configuration that's possible. So these involve projective techniques and processes which we have to understand much better. And Pete gave us a very strong way of trying to understand them. But let me repeat what I said earlier. At least in our context in the Global South, the underlying infrastructure is really about institutions and people. We forget that our people and our infrastructures and our systems actually make up for what a lot of formal systems may actually do. And you have to factor that into that process. And if you don't, you'll either be surprised or you'll be sorry, because something will go around your system and work away around that. So I think we fundamentally have to rethink infrastructures, and digital infrastructures are very much part of these processes. So it's not only physical infrastructures or blue-green stuff that's coming out from ecosystems, it's also the interconnection. And if you come to the IIHS campus, you'll see that there's a biophysical, there's a built environment, but sitting and connecting all of that is a digital infrastructure that enables you to use all the tools that I'm talking about just now, whether it's AI, ML, or at some point of time, these questions will be large enough that you'll have to use quantum computing to try and understand what's happening.
I just wanted to think of, just pulling together all the different strands from the research, from the policy work that we've done. What would you say were kind of, the key takeaways for us as researchers, as practitioners from the work that we did for peak urban? I mean, some of it is, of course, synthesized in the report, but to think a little bit more about what are going forward, also, how has this kind of helped us set up an agenda for work that we want to do at IIHS as well?
I mean, I think one of the core things is, of course, systems, right? And the challenge, of course, is not the systems that you can see and touch and feel. So whether it's the energy system or the mobility system, etc. I think the challenge for us is to try and integrate socio-ecological systems into this frame. And frankly, there is a big gap in both theory and practice in the space of how you integrate technological systems inside that. So there's an entire body of literature and practice around how socio-technical systems change. How do you transform an energy system of a place? How do you get more, better mass transit, etc., and how you do that in place? And there's or let's say, how do you sort of implement efficiency as far as water systems are concerned, or whatever. So there's both a theory and a practice and understanding of institutions that is there in the social technical transition space. And then there is more interesting and challenging literature around social ecological systems. So, because poor people depend considerably and vulnerable people depend on ecological systems for their livelihoods in some senses. And food is a classic example. And, Neha, you've worked significantly on food systems in Bangalore, both on the supply and on the demand and the intermediate scale that's there. So how do these things actually configure themselves, and how are they organized? And what is the relationship between the very rapidly changing ecological reality? And I talked about, Bangalore's fundamental challenges about water. If it has to become like Beijing and, recycle 60% of its water, there have to be phenomenal changes in the landscape, in everyday life. Going from single plumbing systems where, you wash your hands and all the stuff goes down into the drain, you have to move to dual plumbing systems that are there. Then you treat that water locally or otherwise. What kind of pricing systems will enable this to actually work? Is this actually a local common good or not? How does one bring these questions into a governance frame? Are all of the core questions that we're engaged with as we are at the frontiers of these rapidly growing urban systems. It's not the metropolitan areas, but the urban systems that are there. So I think we're trying to get a fairly good handle on this. So systems is one core thing, and unfortunately, planning systems have often degenerated into just about changing land uses, and land uses are an outcome. It's not the underlying process. So I think that's the first thing that's there. The second thing is, what new forms of data understanding and technology would you need to be able to try and figure out how these things actually work? Because especially with, and there are lots of questions on this, with the advent of deep learning and whatever generative AI, there's this idea that you can replace people, processes, institutions with a lot of this fancy stuff that's going to be sitting on machines. In actual fact, I would be very surprised if that were actually to happen, because human systems are much more complex than you can actually imagine. These tools can help us try and get in and understand them, but there are lots of different ways of knowing and understanding that we have just now, because in some senses, in a city like Bangalore, you can mobilize 100,000, 200 citizens to help you understand and improve the quality of how you manage your lakes. They're very concerned about it because they're doing that in some senses. Or if you wanted to deal with questions of food safety or response to a flooding event, you have a completely different set of opportunities now, because people are so well connected. And our imagination of how you work in these spaces is still very situated in the 20th century. And I think we're going to be seeing a significant reorganization of that as we're able to visualize things differently, as new forms of social organizations emerge, as new forms of disruptive institutions emerge. I think the startup ecosystem in these cities is going to really disrupt some of these systems. You can see that already. I mean, the most tangible thing is in platform transportation, but that is coming into other places, both creating opportunities at one end, but also lots of challenges in terms of inequality and people really getting burnt out being part of those systems in some senses, even though they're creating new spaces. So I think systems, data, and technology, and the challenges of injustice, of inequality, and basically making sure that that's what the SDGs are about in some senses, right? Making sure that everybody has access to the same level of security or basic services or a safe place to live across the city. So it's nice to say that no one will be left behind. Doing that is a very, very tough business. And I think, our new understandings help us move in that direction, given that that's a normative frame that I think we've collectively agreed, both inside India, inside the cities we work in, and across the world, that we're trying to kind of work to. And that can only happen through teamwork, through collaboration, by working across disciplines, by by trying to solve these problems collectively, because no single set of people, no single institution has prerogative or control over how we can answer these questions. They have to be co-constructed in some senses. So I think the power of peak was the power of co-construction and learning as we go ahead and being open to the failure of many things. Some ideas don't work. Some methods are inappropriate in certain circumstances, and a lot of policy, because it's framed in a different context and or different imagination, is dysfunctional in many ways. So yeah, I think we learned all of those things in peak.
I think there are a bunch of questions around how we think and imagine sort of urban futures, and how we think about shaping urban futures. Some of it around sort of what constitutes different elements of them, whether sort of images and imaginations are part of it. But I think also, how do we think about facing global environmental change, for example, with the kind of uncertainty that comes with it, and how does one prepare cities of the future for this kind of change that's coming?
I think the big opportunity and also the challenge for us is to prepare citizens for these changes, because I mean, a lot of these questions they cannot be addressed because they're systemic questions, right? Without collective action, and I think that's going to be a very important challenge for us. How to mobilize collective action that is not kind of either deep driven by consumerist interest at all. I mean, or by sort of a mob mentality of picking up things that are interesting, or something that the powers that be want to happen. I think we need to build a fairly thoughtful, reflexive kind of culture in this space, but it has to be available across all, across millions of citizens in some senses. So the answer to that partially lies in education, right? School education, of course, and higher education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but continuing education across our lives, because many of us are now going to live 80 years, and the environment, institutional, economic, political, et cetera, is going to change. We're going to be seeing, generation after generation, considerable shifts and changes. So we have to prepare ourselves for that. So in some senses, creating public learning environments through public education and other processes to make that happen. But that can't happen unless institutions are ready and open to do that, and we have the tools and the languages, and of course the cultural pluralism and the openness to different sets of ideas, so they can contest and they can come out with new forms of co-creation. And of course, because of the influence and the importance of media, social media or otherwise, I think it's very important for us to engage with the creative economy, with the creative communities, to try and help people not only shape public imaginations, but shape what they can do in their own context. Because eventually this is stuff that you have to do in your own backyard. I mean, if you want to do recycling and composting, you can do it on your veranda in your house, and from that will build up a new idea of a circular economy that will not necessarily exploit hundreds of thousands of people who are at the bottom of the economic pyramid in the city, and also deal with nutrients that can go back into agriculture, and also not have the kind of challenges that we have in Bangalore of sometimes of the year the lakes catching fire. So they're connected to each other, and we have to find ways of trying to enable people to have the power and the agency to be able to see those connections in everyday life, and not be disempowered by the structures and processes, including the market at one end or the state, that are forcing them to make choices that they don't want to make. And I think we have the opportunity to do that just now because of digital technology, because of these new methods that are there. And the fact that we have a lot more people who are willing to be engaged, especially younger people in some senses.
So we have another, just almost towards the end of it. I think there's one very specific question, on kind of designing solid waste management for small towns. And I think I was wondering if, drawing on the work that we've been doing in small towns in Karnataka, the work that we do in Tamil Nadu, if there were reflections that you had in response to that.
So I think the quick reflection is that it's much easier to deal with questions of solid waste in smaller towns than other places, partially because of the scale. It's smaller to deal with, etc. And also, at least in India, the small towns have not completely embraced the scale of consumer processes and packaging, etc., that are happening in other places. So the fact that many of the platform systems haven't reached there with the packaging systems and logistics is actually a good thing. But having said that, I think there are 2 or 3 areas which we have to look at very carefully. And I think we're starting to discover the ways. The first thing, of course, which relates directly to the built environment, is we have no clue of how to deal with construction and demolition waste. So, our urban environments and built environments are shifting and changing. So what does that mean? That basically means that buildings are coming down, new infrastructure is being built, lots of material are coming in, and many of them are very carbon intensive. So, for example, when a building comes down and it's made out of brick or reinforced concrete, if you're able to take it and recycle it, it means multiple things. It means that all that stuff doesn't land up in your drains and in your lakes and destroys the environment at one end. The second thing is, because you're able to crush it and use it in aggregate in roads or in maybe buildings, the amount of energy you require as embodied energy in the built environment actually dramatically reduces. And that's a really good thing to do. And pretty much every place needs to do it. The challenge, of course, is the economics of doing that. And so maybe the 500,000 city is a scale of doing that. We don't really know that answers yet, but I would say somewhere at 1 million and above is one critical thing. So dealing with that is very, very important. The second thing is, dealing with a lot of waste in India, at least, that can be composted. We do this very actively. You come to the IIHS campus, you'll see it's net positive in terms of municipal waste. We actually bring in municipal waste, we compost it, and you can see the difference in the landscape. The idea is very simple. We bring in food from across the countryside, it comes into cities, and it goes away as waste, which pollutes the water, pollutes the soil, etc. You can actually deal with it in a decentralized way, or even in a much more organized way. And the bulk of it, because a lot of our waste in urban areas in India is actually compostable. And then you have the complication of dealing with recyclables. And there again, they're a very good system to do it. The question is, how can you tie in employment with people who do recycling for glass, for metals, for paper and things like that, and add to the value. The real problem for us, like in many other parts of the world, is plastic. And that's a horrible and complex problem. And I don't think we've got very clear answers to it, especially plastic that is tied in with packaging. That's a horrible problem that's difficult to deal with. It either goes to landfill, unfortunately, or you combust it. And those are not very good solutions. So I've laid out the whole spectrum for you: historical waste, construction and demolition waste, that's dealing with the stuff that can be composted, stuff that can be recycled and should be done much more significantly. But sitting behind all of that is a culture of consumption, which I think is starting to trouble us quite significantly, even in a country like India. We're a country where people really have used and recycled things. So, clothes that you wear on an occasion are then used for something else, and then, they get recycled and they come down as rags. So people have learned culturally how to use things for a long period of time. We're losing that. And we really have to hold on to that culture of using less and not wasting very much, because you can't embrace a circular economy in a finite planet unless you do that. You have to work on the demand side. And it's not only a question of economic incentives, it's really a cultural question in some senses. And we need to hold on to those cultures in many ways.
We just have a couple of minutes. And so I just want to kind of ask if you had any sort of closing out comments that you wanted to make, just, broad reflections on, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions in the chat. We'll try and respond to them offline later. But if you had any closing thoughts on the kind of work that we've done and going forward.
No, I think the thing is, the world is full of a lot of interesting challenges, and some of them are really going out of control, leading to systemic crises, which we've seen in COVID and climate and all, or let's say poverty is as deep and complex in some, especially urban poverty. So given all of those things, once you're able to get some kind of a systemic handle on what the causes and processes are involved, there are lots of solutions that are there. And I think the power of peak and the power of similar processes like that, which connect up places in different geographies, is you're able to step back and look at what those solution sets are like and what are the common elements that you can try and build together. So, policy borrowing is a complicated story, but if you're able to understand those things and try and imply and sort of apply them, I think we have, a pretty good sense of how these systemic changes can make. So you've got a systemic set of challenges. You need to respond to them systemically. We have a whole range of different options and choices that we have to make, which are required to deal with that. And I guess the work that we're doing on new urban science, connecting that with sustainability science in some senses, and climate science, is really the interface area that's there. Unfortunately, most of our research and academic programs, because they're still so wedded to earlier imaginations, which are important. I mean, I'm not saying that disciplinary imaginations are not important, and they underpin this process, but this space for engagement and learning and experimentation, which Peak provided us, was very important. I think, as countries like India, South Africa, etc., build out their national science foundations and things like that, this is exactly the kind of questions that you have to deal with. How do you connect up natural systems with the built environment, with economic systems, with the climate space, and what are the interactions between them? How will they change over time? What happens if there's a shock that you experience in them? What happens, if a different regime of thinking about economic life actually is entered into these things? We need to experiment and test these things and these processes and systems, and then we can start seeing how to propagate them or develop them in larger contexts. So I think the initiative like this are very, very important, because we need mesoscale laboratories to test these ideas out on, and of course the institutions that come with them, because the ideas are not enough. You need the people, the institutions to try and operationalize them, and of course you need the resources that sit behind them, which of course means that you obviously have to engage with the political economy and the politics, because the resources will not come unless people are convinced that they're really good things that will take them forward, that will try and address these kind of these ongoing things that we're trying to deal with just now. So yeah, Peak, and especially the massive open online course, is the invitation to enter. It's a threshold into that world, which I think some of us have a fairly interesting idea of at the moment.
Thanks, Aro. Thanks for that. It was a really, really interesting conversation. Thank you all for joining us. And if you're interested in learning more and sort of diving deeper into some of these questions, the Shaping Urban Futures MOOC is open for enrollment on Coursera as well as edX. And join Aro, me, and a whole set of other faculty to learn more about how we can shape urban futures to be more sustainable, equitable, and sort of just. All the kind of links to the course, the Peak Urban Report, as well as all the publications are in the chat. If you would like to kind of reach out to us, we're happy to share those with you offline as well. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks, Aro, for a lovely conversation.
Thank you, Neha. That was wonderful.
Bye.
See you, folks.